Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining this webinar. We will just wait a couple of more minutes for people to join, and we will get started in about 2 to 3 minutes. Thank you for your patience. Okay, I think we can get started. So welcome everybody, and thank you for joining this webinar, Out of the Shadows, addressing the gendered impacts of urban violence through the Arms Trade Treaty. My name is Hannah Salama, and I am the Gender and Disarmament Research at the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research. It's my honor to be moderating this event this afternoon. And before I begin, I'd like to share with you some logistical information. First of all, this webinar is being recorded and a video will be made available later on UNIDIR's YouTube channel. We ask that you put your questions in the Q&A box at any point during our discussion. We encourage that you address questions specifically to specific panelists, if that's possible. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can, but of course, due to time, we apologize in advance if not all your questions are answered. We'll be sharing some relevant links in the chat box. And if anything unforeseen happens during this event, you will be sent a backup link to your email. So please join that backup link, but we hope that nothing will happen today. So just by way of introduction, UNIDIR is an autonomous research institute within the UN. It aims to support arms control and disarmament processes by providing states with research and policy ideas to strengthen the role of arms control and disarmament towards a safer and more secure world. At the Gender and Disarmament Program, we conduct research on the impacts of different weapon systems on women, men, boys, and girls. We support the international community in bridging gender equality frameworks with arms control and disarmament processes. We do this through research, dialogue, and by supporting women's full and effective participation in all aspects of arms control and disarmament. Today's event is a very special event because it's a collaboration between UNIDIR and the Gender Equality Network for Small Arms Control, GENSAC. GenSAC is an international network bringing together 80 plus members, primarily women from the Western Balkans, Latin American, and the Caribbean, as well as Africa. These women and men are working on issues of gender and small arms control, as well as development. GenSAC is hosted by Pathfinders for Peaceful, Just, and Inclusive Societies, and acts as a cornerstone to their efforts to have global violence. We are really excited about this collaboration as it allowed us to bring it together global armed violence experts from Latin America, Africa, to discuss in what ways we can better leverage the ATT to address urban armed violence and paying specific attention to its gendered impacts. At the outset, I would like to thank you, the participants, for joining, but also our co-sponsors, Canada, Mexico, Panama, and the Geneva Cities Hub, an organization working to connect cities to local and regional governments to the international Geneva ecosystem. So right now, I have the pleasure of introducing Ambassador Fernando Espinoza Oliveira, the Deputy Permanent Representative of the Permanent Mission of Mexico to the United Nations in Geneva. Ambassador Espinoza Oliveira has been a member of the Mexican Foreign Service for 26 years. He has served in Canada, Brazil, and Switzerland. And at the Foreign Ministry, he held many positions, including the Deputy Director General for Europe and in the Minister's Legal Advisor Bureau. Prior to joining the Foreign Service, Ambassador Espinoza Oliveira was professor in public and international law in Mexico. And thank you, Ambassador, for being with us. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, colleagues and friends, on behalf of Mexico, it is a great pleasure for me to open this side event to the 8th Conference of State Parties of the ATT, which is co-sponsored by Mexico, Canada, and Panama, and hosted by the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research and the Gender Equality in Small Arms Control Network and the Geneva Cities Hub. Today's event, entitled Out of the Shadows, Addressing the Gender Impacts of Urban Violence through the Arms Trade Treaty, brings together researchers, experts, and policymakers to discuss the gender dynamics of urban violence and the role of the ATT in curbing its harmful impacts. It is time to make the gender perspective a rule for all security and violence prevention policies, and not just a component. As you might be aware, Mexico officially endorses a feminist foreign policy, so it is a particular pleasure to co-sponsor this event. We believe gender approaches can be strengthened in disarmament and arms control agencies by applying a gender perspective when examining security challenges and weapons-related issues, and by promoting gender equality and improving women's meaningful participation on agencies related to arms control and disarmament. Let me emphasize something. Gender-based violence is a curse that threatens the progress towards peace building and development of all nations. According to the WHO, it is also a threat of pandemic dimensions, affecting at least 35% of the world's population. Over 80% of violent deaths occur outside of conflict zones and in an increasingly urban world. Most of these deaths take place in cities. Women, men, girls, and boys experience different threats during and after conflict, as well as being differentially impacted by weapons and their flows in non-conflict environments. Armed violence, and particularly armed violence in urban settings, has important age and gender dimensions. In many countries, gun ownership is strongly associated with traditional notions of masculinity that convey authority, privilege, prestige, and power. The presence of firearms in the home increases the risk of accidents, murder, and suicide for family members, and they play an important role in the intimidation and long-term abuse of female partners. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has stated categorically that the diversion of firearms directly fuels gender-based violence against women, especially in the context of domestic violence. Recently, we have witnessed the emergence of regional and global urban networks with specific mandates to aid cities in efforts to build in peaceful communities by shedding light on the scale of urban violence problem and connecting local leaders working to address these challenges. One such network is Peace in Our Cities, a group of 23 mayors and 24 local and international partners from across the world, including mayors of 2 Mexican cities, Guadalajara and Escobedo, working to prevent, to reduce urban violence, and ultimately save lives. Together with GenSAC, these initiatives under the Pathfinders for Peaceful, Just, and Inclusive Societies aim to reduce the level of violence globally by 50% by 2030. Mexico is a long-standing champion of SDG 16 and one of the 43 Pathfinder countries committed to advancing actionable solutions for this implementation. Ladies and gentlemen, the ATT is the first legally binding instrument which recognizes the gender nature of armed violence. Through Article 7.4, it obliges state parties making export risk assessments to take into account whether the exported items could be used to commit or facilitate acts of gender-based violence or serious acts of violence against women and children. The treaty aims to prevent the diversion of weapons from legal markets, which is a major issue all over the world. Improving the implementation of the ATT can prevent weapons diversion, which fuels urban violence, that increases the risks and facilitate the different kind of gender-based violence, including feminicides. The ATT plays an important role in curbing urban violence, especially its gender impacts. Today's event is an opportunity to discuss ideas on how the treaty can be leveraged to address the gender impacts of urban violence through connecting initiatives at the multilateral, regional, and national and subnational level. We do hope this event will be able to stimulate ideas and actions towards this shared goal. Thank you for your attention and participation in this event. I now give the floor to Mrs. Hannah Salama of the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research to introduce our esteemed panelists today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Espinosa Oliveira, for your thoughtful remarks, especially highlighting the gravity of this problem and the research conducted by our United Nations partner on gender-based violence. So without further ado, I would really love to introduce to everyone our panel today. And I will begin with Magda Coss. Magda is an international arms violence expert who is based in Mexico, and she is a member of GenSAC. She is the author of the book Arms Trafficking in Mexico, Corruption, Weaponism, and the Culture of Violence. She is the founder of 2 NGOs in Mexico, and she was formerly the chief of staff of the president of the National Institute for Women in Mexico from 2019 to 2022. So her most recent publication, Understanding the Gendered Impacts of Urban Gun Violence, will be forthcoming and published by GenSAC. And it has been really the inspiration for our discussion today. And I thank Magda for joining us from Mexico City very early this morning.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure for me to be in this relevant event. Well, I will start saying that when early signs of a tendency to violence is flagged, the best opportunity we have to reduce and to prevent gun violence is to limit the access to firearms. In all contexts, but particularly in urban settings, the proliferation of small arms and light weapons increases gun violence. The evidence we have is that it also leads to an increase in gender-based violence and femicide. The legal or illegal flow of arms transfer shifts the most complex violence to individual violence, moving from organized crime and militarization to gender violence and domestic violence. And I think this is very important to address because the firearms that are used in gang-related violence, cartel violence, or even in state violence, eventually it ends in communities, families, and homes. And this happens much more frequently in urban settings. Firstly, because urban settings are being developed in a disorganized way, forcing social sectors into overcrowded areas and lack of public services, including security, lighting, and safe streets. Some of the main triggers of urban violence are these: social deprivation and inequality, and legal or illegal access to firearms. There is something that we need to talk about, marginalization, because it puts additional pressure on individuals, but especially in young men, not only because of poverty, but also because of exclusion. For many men, job and economic insecurity can pose a threat to their masculinity, as the ambassador mentioned, and they can look for power, changing their attitude towards firearms. This is a relevant issue because marginalization in urban areas has a different impact on women than men. And gender is a very important factor, and I'm going to tell you why. The gender perspective allows us to understand the differentiated way in which urban marginalization affects men and women, and how these differences are manifest in inequalities of opportunities and rights. And also it shows power difference and subordination of one group to over other groups. And even if it seems in a first view that men have all the power and women and girls are other minorities that are restrained for safe public spaces, the gender factor puts the population of young men at greater risk of being victims or perpetrators of gun violence. We need to see beyond the economic factor as the only explanation in these motivations of young men to be armed or to join violent or criminal groups. Their motivations cannot be understood without addressing the dynamics of patriarchy and the concept of masculinity. Masculinity, as we all know, are a social construct and are the values, definition, and beliefs of what a man should be and do, and what he should not be according to the patriarchy. In these relationships of male dominance predominates and try to maintain the power over other groups. These relationships promote hegemonic forms of masculinity that dominate others that remain subordinate to them. And firearms have a role in this balance of power. Therefore, many young men join violent structures to comply with this masculinity mandate and establish relationships of domination and subordination over women, but also over other groups of men who are considered weak. Firearms are the most common weapon for killing and intimidating a romantic partner in countries with high rates of gun ownership by civilians. In places with generalized armed violence, violence against women increases significantly. The domination of hegemonic masculinity is manifest not only in a physical way, but also through economic discrimination, cultural and symbolic violence. So firearms, legal or illegal, have a special link with the ideal of hegemonic masculinity and the power that is acquired by targeting others who are considered dangerous or different. One of these predominant roles attributed to hegemonic masculinity is to be the protector of the family and heritage, and sometimes also the territory. That's why it's so important to address this issue on the urban setting. Many studies on men in gangs point out that for many of them, the fact of having a weapon responds to the need to face potential threats from those outside the group or which they consider themselves to belong. It is important to take this gender perspective into account when analyzing armed violence and in the designing of public policies and programs that reflect these different impacts. Also, I think it's very important to make visible gender-based violence to strengthen state capacity to apply in the process of preventing new arms international transfer and prevent diversion. This is the only way in which international agreements may be fulfilled to guarantee women a non-violent life, non-discrimination in any of its forms, control of firearms, human rights, and particularly with the Arms Trade Treaty that is the topic that we are talking this morning. I think I'm going to leave in this point my first participation to give the opportunity to talk about all other angles.
Thank you, Magda, for this overview also of the findings of your report and of the factors which influence urban violence and which make it quite unique to, let's say, armed conflict violence. So let me proceed by introducing our next panelist, and I'm very pleased to introduce to you Dr. Maria Alejandra Otamendi from Argentina, who is the coordinator of the Reports and Registries Unit in Argentina in the Women's Office of the National Supreme Court. This office produces annual reports of the National Registries of Femicides, and it produces a gender map of the Argentine justice. Dr. Otamendi specializes in the study of gender-based violence and armed violence. She is also a member of GenSAC and a researcher and a teacher at the Gino Germani Research Institute in the University of Buenos Aires. So thank you, Alejandra, for joining us bright and early from Buenos Aires. And I'd like to ask you, from the data and that you collect in this observatory, which is very few countries have an observatory which is specifically focused on femicides. I have to highlight that. This is quite unique to Argentina. What trends have you observed based on this data, and how is this data used by policy makers in your government?
Thank you, Hannah, for your introduction. Yes, every year the Women's Office of the National Supreme Court of Justice conducts the National Register of Femicides. With the data that we collected, we could say that in Argentina, between 2017 and 2021, 1 out of 4 femicides were committed with firearms. And 1 out of 3 multiple femicides had a firearm as a mean. This shows the greater lethality of firearms used in gender-based violence. Besides, at least 24% of the guns used in femicides were legally possessed. 7% were licensed firearms, and 17% belonged to the security forces. Then 20% were unlicensed firearms, and in 50% of the cases, this data was not available. So we thought that it's even bigger, the legal possession of the firearms used in femicides. This informs that not only illegal weapons are a risk factor for gender-based violence, but also legal ones. Then what we could say is that 60% of armed femicides occurred inside the victim's house and 13% inside another house. Only 70% of armed femicides took place outside, that is at the public space, only 70%. Between 2020 and 2021, most armed femicides took place on urban areas. That is 88% of the cases. So urban settings are quite important for armed femicides. Regarding offenders, most of the perpetrators that used guns were acquaintances of the victims. 65% were partners or former partners. 13% were relatives, and 11% had other type of relationship. Only 4% of them perpetrators that used a gun was unknown to the victim. And in 7%, there was no data regarding the relationship between the femicide perpetrator and the victim. Then 42% of them committed suicide afterwards, probably with the same gun. So we have this common figure, this common trend that it's femicide suicide, and I have written a text regarding this trend. Finally, 18% of the perpetrators that used firearms to commit a femicide were members of the security forces, mainly active members of provincial police forces. We are going to publish soon a specific report on armed femicides that occurred between 2017 and 2021, compared to femicides with other means, to find the different trends regarding the means used in femicides. Also with detailed information of the firearms used. Regarding your question of what are we using this information for example, we can say that it has been used to require that firearms instructors have to take a course on gender perspective to get their license. And this resolution is based on our data. Also, the data is used to block perpetrators to get a license or to withdraw it if they have one. Finally, to train members of the judicial power to focus on firearms and gender-based violence so they can dictate to seize firearms as a protective measure. So I think that with all this information provided by the register, it is quite clear that ATT, and in particular Article 7, can help to reduce gender-based violence, in particular in urban settings. In this regard, we encourage other states to include variables regarding firearms used in femicides in their registries. So then I would talk more detail on the methodological aspects of how to measure femicides with firearm use. So that's.
Thank you very much, Alejandra, for this. I think what struck me particularly is even though you don't have, for 50% of the feminicides, you don't have the data on firearms, you still identified that 20% are unlicensed. And this really points to the potential problem of diversion and the role that not only Article 7.4 can play, but the ATT as a whole plays in preventing diversion. And I hope we can discuss this further with our panelists as well. And at this point, I would like to introduce our colleague, Joseph Dube, who is the Director for Disarmament and Arms Control, which is an organization based in Johannesburg, South Africa. Joseph is a member of GenSAC as well, and he is also a long-standing member of the International Action Network on Small Arms. Joseph is a seasoned leader in the area of multilateral disarmament, and he has worked in his own country on initiatives to reduce gender-based violence and promote women's participation in disarmament. He formerly worked for Amnesty International, Gun Free South Africa, and the World Council of Churches, among other organizations. So Joseph, thank you for joining us from Johannesburg. And I would like to ask you about the context, the specific context in South Africa. How does urban violence play there, and also in the SADC region? What are the unique qualities of this kind of violence in this region?
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you very much. And I would like to take the opportunity to thank the ambassador who opened the side event as well from Argentina. I hope I'm audible. Having said that, I just want to make a note that I do not conflate GBV with violence against women, because GBV, or gender-based violence, is a broader concept, because sometimes men and boys in vulnerable situations are selected as victims of violence on the basis of their gender. Hence, gender-based violence was differentiated from violence against women in the ATT, and because we're talking about the ATT. But violence against women is the major part of gender-based violence. For example, I think it has been found that in addition to women and girls, many men and boys are also raped in all conflicts. And particularly, for example, I think recently we saw in Yemen and Ukraine that happened. However, when addressing violent masculinity, we need to avoid creating a stereotype of men and boys who are in most countries, or in particular, even in South Africa particularly, do not want to carry or even want a gun. And so I think it's very important that the point of gun ownership, the relationship between gun violence and the availability of firearms, it's a combination that one has to emphasize. And I think that's what I'm going to be talking about today. I think the previous speakers did indicate the ownership of firearms generally around the world, and that a huge number of 2/3 of firearms are owned by civilians. And that, I think it's an indication of also indicating the number of people that then become victims of gun violence. And I think in South Africa particularly, just recently, I think last week, the Minister of Police released a states, around violence and crime in South Africa. And they looked at the last 3 months of April, May, and June, the number of murders that happened in the last 3 months was sitting at 6,424. And of that, women, I think there were about 558 women who were murdered. Although I think I don't have specific stats in terms of how many women were killed by gun violence or by guns in this case. But I think broadly what the minister said was that 2,766 people who died. Of that 6,000, these 2,000 were killed by firearms. So clearly an indication of the availability of firearms in South Africa is the contributor and the contributing factor adding to a violent society. And therefore, I think it's important that one needs to say that for numbers to reduce, for gun violence to reduce in South Africa, we also need to reduce the availability of firearms. Of course, I think the government has done its best to make sure that we regulate firearms in terms of ownership. The Firearms Control Act just recently reduced the number of ownership of firearms. Before people were allowed to own as many as they could, but now the number has been reduced to 4. But also it has also linked to what we call the Domestic Violence Act, that anyone who wants to own a firearm, they have to make sure that they don't have history of violence or they don't have a history of domestic violence. But of course, it does not stop the person who really wants a firearm, irregardless whether they have domestic violence history. They can always get the firearms illicitly. So in other words, they would get the firearm illegally and own the firearm illegally. But also, I think even if the number of people that are killed, usually in South Africa, I think the stats would indicate that more young men are being killed by firearms, which means that more young men own firearms, but also more young men are killed by firearms. But then it does not exclude that women also are victims psychologically, because the availability of a firearm at home actually in itself tries to send a message to the woman that who is in charge. Whoever has got the firearm, in this case, it will be the man who then says, I am in charge. So it instills fear in the women in the home. And recently, the president of South Africa did actually say that gender-based violence and femicide has become an epidemic in the country. And there's a need to make interventions that will reduce gender-based violence and femicide. In conclusion, I think one point that I wanted to indicate is that recently there was a national instruction from the Minister of Police to then say all police stations in South Africa needs to open a desk or an office specifically that will focus on gender-based violence and femicide. And that has been established, and I think we're seeing more and more police stations starting to open them, but the question will be to make sure that the public is aware of this particular office and how they can use this particular office. And hopefully that young men and women, young men and as well as boys will actually avail themselves to attend the office to assist for assistance. I think the other question that I was asked was around what could be done. And I think at international level, at multilateral level, I think it's important that we need to bring women to participate in these conferences and make interventions. And I think a good example was at the BMS recently in July, where a young woman was invited to come and address the UN Program of Action conference. And she comes from, United States of America, and she has been a victim of violence, gun violence in particular, and she addressed the conference. So I think it's important that we need to try to make sure that that space is opened up for more and more victims of gender-based violence, or particularly violence against women, where firearms are being used, to come to these particular conferences and address. And even these particular side events should actually be given to them to make sure that they speak from their own experience, but influence policies to make sure that there's a shift in policy, but as well as a shift in behavior. Because part of it is that I think we can have good policies, but if behavior does not change, it does not actually improve the quality of lives of women. I thank you.
Thank you, Joseph, and thank you for also reminding us about the terminology we're using, gender-based violence versus violence against women and feminicides. These are related concepts, but as you say, they're not the same thing, and gender-based violence affects both men and women. But mainly, the data has shown that it affects women. And it's very good to hear about the progress that is being done in South Africa in terms of more awareness on this issue, especially by local authorities. And I look forward to coming back with another question to you about how we connect this, a multilateral instrument such as the ATT with local issues. But for now, I would like to bring in a dear colleague and friend who is Grisselle Rodríguez, who is the counselor at the permanent mission of Panama to the United Nations in Geneva. Grisselle is also the co-chair of the Arms Trade Treaty Working Group on Transparency and Reporting. At the mission, she holds many portfolios. She's very active in Geneva, including the UN Human Rights Council, and covers all of the arms control and disarmament meetings that we have here in Geneva. And Grisselle, given your experience, given your role, I'd like you to sort of outline the ways in which better implementation of the ATT can address the urban armed violence in general, but also the gendered impacts as the main focus of our event today.
Thanks, Hannah, and good afternoon, everyone. Well, cities around the world suffer from the proliferation of arms, particularly of small arms and light weapons and their ammunition. Their widespread availability due to poorly regulated arms transfer is a key enabler of urban violence and increase the human, economic, and social costs in various regions of the world, and has a gender and age dimension as explained by the panelists. It often intersects with human rights violations and abuses, and gender-based violence affects the resilience and well-being of communities and hampers efforts to implement the SDGs. Yet responding and understanding effectively the urban violence is a difficult task, as this phenomenon is a complex one and raises challenges for existing arms control tools and normative approaches. So against this background, the ATT has the potential to reduce and prevent urban violence by offering a significant opportunity to focus on the conventional arms and ammunition as the tools used in this type of violence, and identify risk factors associated with the availability and supply of these weapons. It can increase urban safety and security by curbing the uncontrolled proliferation and misuse of arms. The ATT recognizes in its preamble the security, social, economic, and humanitarian consequences of the illicit and unregulated trade in conventional arms, and that women and children account for the vast majority of those adversely affected by armed violence. This also applies in the context of urban violence. It is important to recall that the ATT establishes measures to combat the diversion of arms by requiring states parties to establish and develop their national control systems, which in turn can act as a mechanism for helping to prevent illicit or irresponsible trade in conventional arms and ammunition. These national control systems could help to reduce arms flowing into cities that are otherwise misused to commit urban violence and which facilitate gang and terrorist activities. Article 6 on prohibitions and Article 7 on export and export assessment are key elements of the ATT, as they provide a series of prohibitions and risk assessment obligations aimed at regulating the international trade in conventional arms. For example, Article 6 outlines a series of circumstances in which state parties must prohibit transfers of conventional arms, their ammunition, and parts or components covered by the scope of the treaty. When an export is not prohibited under Article 6, the exporting state party must assess the potential risk of this export on the basis of a series of criteria listed in Article 7. In doing this, the exporter must consider whether there are measures that could be undertaken to mitigate such risk. In cases where the risk of the negative consequences is determined to be overriding, export should not be authorized. So accordingly, all state parties are required to conduct risk assessments prior to the authorization or issuance of export license. This includes, for example, evaluating the risk that transferred arms could be used to violate human rights, breach ISL, or support organized crime or terrorism. Therefore, the decision-making process occurs within a preventative approach. Also, the ATT contributes to the protection of people and helps to ensure that international human rights standards are respected, implemented, and enforced in conventional arms trade. The ATT risk assessment requires the states party to consider the impact a transfer may have on human rights. It has the potential to prevent transfers to end users engaged in human rights violations and abuses through misusing conventional arms. The ATT can reduce the burden placed on a public health system by urban violence. Urban violence has taken the world stage as the primary driver of violent deaths, and it victimizes even more people by spreading injuries, disability, and psychological distress. Furthermore, the ATT is the first multilateral treaty to link irresponsible international arms trade, the illicit arms trade, and gender-based violence. As part of its regulations of international arms transfer, the ATT also requires state parties to consider the risk that an arms export could be used to commit or facilitate serious acts of gender-based violence or serious acts of violence against women and children. In doing so, it contributes to the achievement of intersecting objectives contained in a wide range of international frameworks, such as the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, especially SDGs 5, 11, and 16, the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda, the Secretary General's Agenda for Disarmament, and other related conventional weapons instruments, in particular, the UNPOA. Thanks.
Thank you, Grisselle, and thank you particularly for highlighting the intersectional nature of the ATT, or how it intersects with different agenda, including the women, peace, and security. And my colleague just shared a very useful tool for all actors, including member states, which was produced by UNIDIR and Control Arms, called Gender and the Arms Trade Treaty. It's a quick 2-pager, which provides some data on the problem, but also some ideas on how to go further in implementing Article 7.4. How can we overcome some challenges to risk assessment and many other challenges that member states sometimes face when trying to implement this article. So I encourage everybody to have a look at this. And I will continue with my line of questioning before I move on to the Q&A with the audience. And I see that we have some questions already, and I encourage everyone to put in their questions as we are talking, so you don't need to wait till the Q&A session, but please put in your questions as soon as you have them in the Q&A box. And so I would just like to go back to Magda. Given your research and the findings in the report, I'd like to know what are some of the good practices among states and at local levels that you found in Latin America that addresses GBV through arms control policies. And I think, it's very important to share best practices, and this is very much in the spirit of the CSP 8 as well. So Magda, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Well, I'm going to try to keep short my intervention, but there are some aspects that my colleagues have mentioned already, and I think that there are very important things to highlight as good practices. The collection of data that Alejandra mentioned, it is especially important because we know that all the data we have is age, especially youth. It's very important. Gender, sex, age are very important to disaggregate the data to have more information about the gun violence situations that happen in Latin America. For example, in our region, men aged between 15 and 29 years old are 80% more likely to be victims of armed violence. Also something very important that Grisselle already mentioned is the participation and commitment of governments to increase transparency and to have better information on legal transfer on small arms and, as I said, on the disaggregate data, and to link all this research and investigation of violent situations with another situations, for example, with health data and also gender and women, peace and security information. As Joseph mentioned, the inclusion of more women in arms control and disarmament position has demonstrated a great impact on peace building efforts. Women have proven to be powerful agents of change. So I think it's very important to increase and to make progress on goal 5 of the Sustainable Development Objective, to have to achieve a substantive equality between women and men, and to bring closer, as I said, these two agendas of women, peace and security and the gun control agenda, and also to increase, as in the 2 pages of the Untitled paper suggests, to facilitate dialogue among experts in these 2 agendas. I think regarding legislation, some policies that have proved to be effective are the restriction of access to firearms to those with a history of gender-based violence or domestic violence, including the law enforcement officers. And I think this is very important because there's a lack of transparency when we are talking about military or law enforcement officers. Also, the removal of firearms from people with complaints of gender violence or past violence, because we know from studies and data that a past history of violence is a better prediction of another situation of gun-related violence. Also, another good practice is to have effective protocols on the use of law enforcement firearms, so they can only use them during the working hours, and they cannot take them to their homes, because this is related with a lot of femicides by enforcement officers, of military officers. Of course, we know that one of the most effective ways of reducing gun violence is to limit the possession and number of firearms in the home. And I think that's one point that is very, the ATT could be very useful, because we know, as also Grisselle mentioned, that all the black market and the illegal weapons are pulled by the legal transfer of guns. One point, to keep it short, but I think that we need to understand that we need much more profound change, and we need a cultural transformation, because in the long term, we must support these policies that are going to create a substantive equality, and to transform this masculine mandate, because the masculine mandate and the patriarchy has a factor of competition and destruction that when it is combined with firearms, it becomes more dangerous, not only for women, but for men and for all people's safety and well-being. Also, I think that's why, therefore, it's essential to transform cultural, social cultural norms in order to curb the social acceptance of all kinds of violence. No type of violence should be tolerated.
Thank you, Magda, for answering my question so well. And you also highlighted the cultural aspects and the what we call negative masculinities, which Joseph also highlighted as an issue in the South Africa and in the region. And here I see that, you know, urban armed violence from Africa or Latin America tends to look the same, and the factors tend to be similar. So this is, you know, it's a good way to address it. And you also highlighted the need for increased data and more disaggregated data by gender and age, which brings me, Alejandra, to my next question to you. You know, what does it take for governments to collect this data? What are the resources needed, the expertise in terms of capacity, budget? You know, how big is your operation? It's kind of nice to know practically, you know, when we're giving these recommendations on increasing data collection, what are the practicalities of running a national observatory on feminicides?
Well, Hannah, it's a tough question. It's a difficult question because regarding violence, you always have like 3 different types of sources: health sources, police information, but also justice information, legal cases. In our case, our observatory, our register is based on legal cases as a primary source, because it has a lot of data. We have information of the situation previously, if there were, you know, reports against this perpetrator regarding gender-based violence or not, and you have all the information regarding the situation, the attack, and of course the murder, but also all the consequences for this perpetrator regarding the justice system. So I think it's the best source that you can have. But in every case, what we collect as data for femicides, it's not only the cases that are typified as such, as femicides, but also other cases that, well, we analyze through a protocol, and we can identify as a femicide, even the justice system at the very beginning doesn't say so. This is because the justice system is also, well, lacking of gender perspective. So we need to include as femicides more cases than those cases typified legally as such. So saying this, I'm talking about specifically about gun use in femicides. Well, we are using different variables. One of the variables that we use to measure this impact is the mean used to commit them, of course. And we include the following categories: firearms of the armed and security forces, because this is a very important point, and Magda also mentioned it, that at least in our country, police forces can take their legal firearms, their weapons, to their houses, to their homes, because in some cases they use these weapons for other jobs, you know, as a private public service that they have. But what we could see, and the figures show this, is that these guns that are legally owned are used against their partners in their homes. And in some cases, we have even found that women police officers that have their guns are being attacked with their own guns in their own homes. So this is very risky, and this is why I completely agree that we need to reduce the access to arms, to firearms, to guns at their homes. Because as we showed, 3 out of 4 femicides occurred inside the victim's home. So regarding the variables, well, firearms owned by the arms of the security forces, licensed firearms, unlicensed firearms, firearms without data about license, and also other type of means used to commit femicides: knives, fire, poisoning or intoxication, physical strength, and other means. And the other variable that we also pay attention to is the involvement of members of security forces in femicides, distinguishing the type of police force that well, this perpetrator belonged to, and his situation inside this police force. If he was active, if he was retired, because in some cases they keep the weapon that was provided by the armed forces, the security force, the police force, and they keep it as, you know, a present of retirement or something like that. And then if it was expelled, he was expelled for this force, but he kept the weapon. So we also study this variable to show this link of easy access to guns and femicides. And of course, what is underlying is this dimension of hegemonic masculinity, because, well, what is under this possession of guns and this attack to women, well, for gender motives. So after the register is published, a form is sent to every province which had cases of femicides committed with firearms. In that form, we collect more specific data of the type of firearm used, its caliber, its model, the origin, the serial number, if it still has a serial number or not, and if it is legally registered or not, and if the perpetrator was a legal owner or if he wasn't. Finally, we ask if the judicial power of each province informed the National Agency of Controlled Materials, the ANMAC, of the femicide committed with firearm, in order that this agency can block the perpetrator to become a legal owner if he wasn't one, or to withdraw his license if he had one. So it's very important to have this connection with the National Registry of Guns, or the way it's called in each country. So we can implement these measures to prevent other cases, even not only of femicides, but of gender-based violence with firearms. So, well, at least I could say regarding the difficulties to gather data on these issues is that in some cases, femicides committed with firearms are that the firearms used has not been seized or found at the crime scene. And this is a problem. So in some cases, we only know the caliber of the gun used because of the forensic information, but not because we found the fire gun. So also we have problems when the perpetrator committed suicide afterwards, that it's around 20% of the cases. So it's quite high. So in some cases, the legal case is closed, so the gun is not seized or found. So we cannot know what type of gun was used in that cases. Also, some lack of training to identify in firearms can explain this incomplete information that we have already said, that in some half of the cases, we don't know if it's legally owned or not. Well, that's quite a lot, but we are improving this by training, for example, offered by UNLIREC, that is helping our judicial power to become more aware of the link between guns and femicides and gender-based violence in general. So I think that's some of my advice on this topic, how to measure it.
Thank you, Alejandra. And you highlighted kind of a key aspect to data gathering is the coordination between national levels and let's say subnational and local levels, and creating protocols where this information can flow more easily. And that's in fact one of the recommendation in the gender and the Arms Trade Treaty fact sheet that UNIDIR has done. And it's good to see that's already being implemented in Argentina. I just really want to quickly turn back to Joseph, because this is an issue that's been reoccurring in our discussion about violent masculinities. And, you know, just very quickly, what are some of the ways that this is being addressed, maybe in your context, or what do you think, even if there are no, what kind of initiatives would you promote to address violent masculinities?
Thank you very much. I think the first thing is just get the gun out of the way. That would be the simplest answer. But I think it's important, I think linking the whole issue to how do we then deal with that? I think first is to try and work on the whole issue of violence in itself. The fact that we do have systems in place, you know, or acts in place to deal with firearms and gun ownership. Usually the intervention of justice system only happens when damage has been done. So what we want to do is to prevent the damage to happen. And so therefore, I think it's important that we need to work on re-educating men in terms of that we need to change our behavior in terms of how we relate to the other gender. And to make sure that, I think part of it is that in training young men and young women, that this world belongs to all of us. It does not belong to a specific group of people. So therefore, I think it's important that we do that. And I think I just also wanted to emphasize the point about gender-based violence when it becomes lethal. It becomes lethal when there's a firearm in the equation. And so it's important, and constantly, I think there should be a system of making sure that even if an individual owns a firearm, and in this case, usually in a family setting, it's always a man that owns the firearm, that firearm somehow should be linked into the system and link it to the partner, so that if the partner raises a red flag, automatically the police should be able to pick it up to say, in this household or in this family, there is a firearm. Because when the complainant comes to the police or to the justice system, the perpetrator is not there. So the information about the firearm at home, it has to be voluntarily be presented by the victim. In some instances, the victim doesn't say it, but the system should be able to pick it up, irregardless of whether the perpetrator or the victim has indicated that there's a firearm at home. So therefore, I think it's important that we need to look at a way of making sure that we link that. Either if it depends how the arrangement of the partnership is, but somehow there should be a way of making sure that it happens. So I think it's important that we do that, so that we're able to then address the problem of firearms and removing them even before the damage is done. But also I think it's important that constantly the review of acts, because perpetrators or people who own firearms always try to find loopholes and open those loopholes and use those loopholes. So therefore, I think it's important that we need to find a way of making sure that there's a constant review of the act. And people who are working in the gender space need to start to put pressure, because I think the tendency is that people who are working on gender issues tend to focus on celebratory events. We need to then start looking at policies. We need to start influencing not only policy in general, but also influence policy that has to do with arms and firearms. For example, I think a good example would be the ATT itself, the CSPs. These meetings are being attended, but hardly, even in the government officials, representatives, hardly see a gender focal point attending those meetings. So therefore, I think it's important that we need to look at ways of how do we then make sure that when these meetings are happening in Geneva, the national focal points on gender are actually part of the delegation, so that we are actually better understand these issues of firearms, because they speak generally when we talk about gender-based violence, they tend to be general and without even looking at the impact of a firearm, existence of a firearm in a society and how it impacts on the other gender. So it will actually build that capacity as well. So I just wanted to say that I'm not sure whether I'll get another opportunity to respond to the point of linking what can be done in terms of multilateral, in this case, at the ATT. What are some of the things that should be addressed at the ATT? Just want to check with you, Hannah. Can I say that now, or I can?
Yeah, I think if we can turn to Grisselle at this point, just to bring us back, and then we can take some questions from the audience as we aim to finish just before 3 in order to enable people to attend the main session. But thank you, Joseph. You have already pointed out some great practices that could be done, including gender focal points in ATT delegation, as well as including, earlier in your remarks, you also mentioned including survivors as part of these multilateral process to really bring messages home. And these are, just some ways we can link the international multilateral level with the local level. And I just wanted to quickly turn to Grisselle before the session starts to ask her about her expectations for CSP8 in addressing the gendered impacts of armed violence. What can you tell us from there?
Thanks, Hannah. I hope that conversations like the one we're having today would create more awareness raising among all stakeholders in the ATT about the ways in which the illicit or irresponsible trade in conventional arms and ammunition and their diversion can fuel urban violence, including its gendered impacts. State parties may include or promote discussions on arms proliferation and urban violence in future CSP debates, including through a specific thematic debate. Also, all the working groups could be encouraged to consider these questions in their sessions. In doing so, it will be important to revisit the commitments made at the CSP5 related to gender aspects. The full, equal, meaningful, and effective participation of women in all decision-making and operational processes and structures continue to be crucial and should thereby be guaranteed to ensure that all views are taken into account. At this point, will never be overemphasized until we see tangible results. State parties to the ATT should be encouraged to include the risk of urban violence as part of their transfer assessment, which in turn can reduce the risk of arms reaching unauthorized end users like gangs or organized crime. ATT transparency and reporting play a key role. Used as an early warning signal for potential armed violence, including urban violence, it can reveal arms circulation trends by region or by end user. In this way, it helps states parties to strengthen their conflict prevention efforts and to better fulfill their commitment to reduce human suffering. I believe states parties can certainly improve reporting and transparency in this area, but it will depend on their willingness to engage in regular and public reporting on their decisions regarding arms transfer authorizations and whether there's a room to revise the ATT voluntary templates for the initial and annual reports to accommodate specific questions in that regard. In the meantime, I invite state parties to report at the very least if transfers are being denied due to concerns related to urban violence or gender-based violence, even if details of the denial cannot be disclosed. The fact that those have been invoked as grounds for denial will help to normalize this practice in national reports submitted by other states parties. So over to you, Hannah.
Thanks. Thank you, Grisselle, and some very good proposals coming from Panama, especially of like how we can include urban violence and risk factors such as organized crimes in the risk assessment, as well as improve reporting on whether transfers have been denied as a result of GBV. That would certainly be very interesting information to have from member states and very useful. And so I just wanted to turn to the questions that we have in our Q&A box. And I encourage people to also ask questions as we are responding to these. And the first one, I think, are geared towards Magda. And I think, Magda, I will ask you a few questions that you can respond to, and then we can move into the other questions. So the first one, as I understand it, is that there are certain rural areas in Mexico that suffer from GBV, and how do we balance this focus of urban versus rural in that specific context? And the second question would be what percentage of gun violence in urban environments are directly related to drug trafficking? So how can we address this? So if you like to go ahead with these two questions,
Yeah.
and also if the ambassador would like to react to this, I welcome his remarks. Magda, you have the floor.
Yeah, well, regarding the question that Jeff Y asked on what percentage of gun violence is related to drug trafficking, I think it's very difficult to answer because drug cartels have diversified and are involved in many other crimes. Some experts point to more than 20 different types of crimes like kidnapping, human trafficking, assault, and other kind of crimes. So, but I think that we have to put attention that firearms facilitate the diversification of these groups and also the recruitment of young people to the gangs and to the drug cartels. And it became easier for drug cartels to be involved in all this kind of illegal activity. Also because sometimes when young people involved with drug cartels or gangs, it's very difficult for them to go out of the gangs or the organized crime. And also that is because of the gun violence related with that. Regarding to the question on Zacatecas, I think that gun violence has to be addressed in a very similar way in urban context areas than in rural areas, because we have to limit the access to guns and to well, in that scenario, the ATT is a very useful tool to be pretty aware that if the area in question, the state in question, is a very violent zone or a state where there's a lot of presence of organized crime or some human rights violations can be the firearm can be used in human rights violations. It has to be stopped or it has to be reduced the amount of legal transfer of firearms that can go to that kind of place.
If I may add something, Hannah?
Yeah.
Well, adding to Magda's comments, yes, approximately in Mexico, 79% of the population lives in urban areas and 21% in rural areas. But as Magda pointed out, the problem should be tackled simultaneously. I mean, yes, indeed, I think this is a multidimensional problem which requires multidimensional answers. For instance, strengthening the social fabric, strengthening social communities, strengthening families, strengthening the law itself, the people who are enforcing law. And something that Magda mentioned about the use of firearms, probably a particular measure that was implemented by the Mexican government, probably you're aware of this. We basically filed a lawsuit against several companies, smaller gun manufacturers of the United States in 2021. We are basically suing dozens of US companies in the United States, in the state of Massachusetts. And we received the support of 13 states of the United States, including California and two Caribbean states. And basically what we are arguing is that, well, and it has to be with the ATT, because the ATT does not only involve diversion of arms, but also illicit traffic. Sometimes weapons are sold in the first states, we find them in the first states, and they are used by the international crime, by the organized crime. So we are trying to get the attention to the responsibility of all states for not only for the production of weapons, for selling the weapons, but the transmission of these weapons. I mean, to make them accountable and to make think twice. I mean, what's happening with all the small arms that are being sold in one territory, but at the end of the day, end up on the first state, which makes the situation very complex. And that's part of the ATT. And not probably the one solution, the only solution, but a very important component of this the multidimensional way to address a very complex problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And just to give Joseph another chance to speak on issues of connecting the global to the local, there is a question here, which is what are the most important actions that members of parliament can take to address this topic? How can we bring this into in the spheres of MPs? Joseph, I believe that you are muted still.
So members of parliament, I do apologize. Members of parliament are key stakeholders in these debates and in these discussions. And therefore, I think it's important that parliamentarians play a critical role. I think even at local level, when it comes to their constituency, they need to start asking for data in terms of breaking down the data. And as I think has indicated that disaggregated data is required, that the MPs need to know who, what age, and at what point are these victims of gender-based violence or where firearms are being used, that they need to have that kind of information at hand, but also play a role in terms of educating communities. And I think, as according to Ambassador has indicated, that there's a need for constant training and educating communities and families in terms of how we relate to one another and how we can change behavior. And of course, they're not, psychologists, but I think it's important that they can play that particular role. But also, most of the time when these meetings happen in the, for example, these international multilateral meetings happen, hardly these reports get back to the MPs. And I think it's important that MPs need to start be asking these questions in Parliament to say, there was this particular meeting, what happened, what were the issues discussed, to some extent, include the whole issue of gender to say, were there any discussions around gender and gender-based violence and femicide? What were the outcomes? And how are we going to implement these particular outcomes? Because most of the time, every time we go to the CSP, there's no reports. And I think probably, the delegate from Panama will agree with us that hardly people are reporting, states are reporting. So I think it's important that if parliamentarians can start sitting on these diplomats or these technocrats to make sure that they are actually reporting back to capital, but also they're able to get these issues being implemented in communities. So I think that's what I would share, but assist us as parliamentarians to develop guidelines. Most of the time we always look for technocrats to assist us to develop guidelines in terms of gender mainstreaming, but parliamentarians know better as well. They need to start coming up with some of these proposals to say, go to the the CSP, these are the guidelines that you should share, in your report to other states in terms of how we can better mainstream, gender when it comes to gender perspectives when it comes to the ATT. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joseph. And we are just about, running out of time, but I would really like to bring in Kamila Kameleva from the Geneva Cities Hub, which is an organization that supports cities to contribute more effectively to multilateral processes and provides a platform to discuss urban issues such as the ones we've discussed today. Kamila is the co-director of programs and administrations, and prior to working at the Geneva Cities Hub, she was the executive manager of the Geneva Academy, where she worked a lot on the ATT, and also she was working for the Human Rights Council. So Kamila, I pass the floor over to you for closing remarks.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Hannah, colleagues, Excellency. I'll be extremely short because first you want to go to the meeting of the member states, and second, I want to contribute to the debate. So it will be concluding remarks upon what you said and just a very short reflections. So first of all, when we talk about urban violence, that means that we treat cities like places where things happen. Now, we learned at the Geneva Cities Hub, and we are all of us former national diplomats. So now we speak about local and regional governments because we wish to give a role to these municipalities, to these municipal governments into the reactions on policies and, in our case, fight of urban violence. So to reply to one of the questions, also in order of concluding remarks, I think it was asked by Joseph, what can be done more? Invite to the next meeting of the member states in a side event, or really you can do this with us. I'm not applying for the job, but we can do it as we are a platform. Some local and regional authorities, it is really tremendously helpful to hear their views, but also how they tackle, basically the implementation or non-implementation by national governments of many different instruments. And this comes the second point here, which is when states ratify or become signatories of international instruments, and they do not implement it or do not implement it in a trickle way, problems, non-solved problems fall on local authorities, because the local and regional authorities are the ones closer to the population. They're the ones where a woman will go and see first when there is a problem in the family on the street, and these are the politicians and the authorities closer to the people. So work with them, trickle down. Of course, I know that international public law is priority of states, but trickle down the implementation and also the making, of the national policies and laws with local and regional governments. Particular point, we spoke quite a lot in the webinar about data. It is true that local and regional governments in many occasions say they are lacking the so-called disaggregated data. That means the data which is relative to regions, to cities, and the data which they can work with. So I know that the Arms Trade Treaty creates a register, national register of arms. So maybe with the digitalization and the means we have today, we can create a true disaggregated data of use of weapons in different regions and discuss this even on a national level with municipalities. I'm sure that somewhere there are good practices on this, although I'm not obviously a researcher, so I don't know where, but you guys in Latin America, you have many good practices. Mexican government in particular, I have worked 1 year with the first president of the Human Rights Council, Mexican ambassador. They have an open policy, also Panama, also other Latin American and many other countries. So this is probably a way to tackle this, not only from the top down. So nations who have ratified, the national governments who have ratified the treaty, but also from the bottom, use the local and regional authorities as alliances to the possible extent into the implementation of the Arms Trade Treaty and combating the gender-based violence. So Hannah, that's my 2 minutes. Thank you very much for inviting me once again, and happy to continue the discussion.
Thank you, Camila, especially for your extremely practical recommendation and advice about how we can connect the Arms Trade Treaty further with local and regional organization, and as well as the invitation to do another side event, which I love, of course, to continue the discussion. In closing, I would really like to thank participants for their engagement and our co-sponsors, Canada, Panama, Mexico, and the Geneva Cities Hub for making this event possible, and to our panelists who thank you for adding such depth and clarity to this discussion, and we look forward to collaborating with you soon. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a nice day.